Welcome to Windows on the World with me, Mark Windows, 3 times a week at 10 p.m. GMT, Monday, Tuesday and Thursday, bringing you cutting-edge news, empowering information and no conspiracy theories. On tonight's show, how does a planet as far away as Saturn have such an influence on symbols, religion and our system of law and order? If you don't think it does, we are going to give you some insight into symbols and conventions associated with this age-old primeval sun, whose position in the sky could have changed. There was a time when it could have been much nearer and exerted much more influence. To discuss this, we have Troy McLaughlin, whose interest in the electric universe theory led him into the study of this huge presence and its enigmatic rings. And also we have Jay Weidner, author, filmmaker and Hermetic scholar, who has been described by Wired magazine as an authority on the Hermetic and alchemical traditions and an erudite conspiracy hunter, a modern-day Indiana Jones. His ongoing quest is to find mankind's spiritual destiny. Jay Weidner, hi, are you there?
I am. How are you?
Great to have you on again, Jay.
Yeah.
We had a really brilliant show last time talking about Kubrick's films.
Yep.
And today we're going to talk about the Cult of Saturn. Now, this is something that you've studied quite extensively, isn't it?
Yeah, I have. It's a fascinating subject, actually.
Yeah, so the age of Saturn, the official age, is around 4.5 billion years, which is also the assumed age of the universe. Now, we know nothing about really when Saturn was formed, but it does seem to have a huge influence. Now, Saturn worship and influence goes back much further than the current religions. So why do these religions incorporate Saturnian symbols from ancient times?
Well, I think that actually the worship of Saturn preceded the worship of Jove or Jovian or Zeus or Yahweh or Jehovah, whatever you call him, who's really represented by the planet Jupiter. And before that, as Troy knows, Saturn was the main worship planet. Why? I don't know. Troy's opinion on the electric universe is extremely interesting. It can't be proven, but it's extremely interesting. What I find interesting about Saturn is the fact that it is the farthest planet away that we can actually see with our naked eye, and it has all of these historical people in history who have been our rulers have been principally Saturnian worshipers. And everything from Set in Egypt, who was the evil god, I guess you could call him, all the way to today with the New World Order is apparently Saturnian. The Germans that worked on Operation Paperclip were part of Saturnian society, which is why they named the Saturn V rocket that went to the moon, supposedly, that's why they named it that. And also I think it's also why NASA is more or less obsessed with Saturn, which is why the Cassini craft is out there right now. They were willing to risk 72 pounds of plutonium on the space shuttle when they launched it to get to Saturn. You can imagine what would have happened if that space shuttle had exploded on its launch. It would have killed everybody in the world. But they didn't seem to care. They just wanted to get to Saturn. And they've been out at Saturn, and they've been photographing it, and the moons around Saturn. They found some incredibly interesting things. The most incredibly interesting thing that they found is, of course, Iapetus, the moon, which appears to be either artificial or has been manipulated in the past. And which is ironic because this goes all the way back to Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick in 2001, because the original planet that the astronaut Bowman was going to in the book 2001: A Space Odyssey was Iapetus, the moon of Saturn. Supposedly Kubrick couldn't redo Saturn. The rings were too difficult for his special effects department, so they switched the planet in the movie to Jupiter. But of course, I don't buy that. I believe that he was told, no, you can't do that. And so he switched it, and not for a second do I believe that Douglas Trumbull in the special effects department working for Stanley could have made could not have made the rings of Saturn believable. So it all goes back to this secret society and how they run things. And they are Saturnian. They worship Saturn. They worship time. They have enslaved us with time because Saturn is the ruler of time. And I'm sure Troy can go on with much more about this, but basically we have to come to grips with this fact that we're being ruled by this planet for reasons that we don't understand.
That's exactly right, and we're going to get to this enormous influence that it exerts a bit later in the show. But first of all, just to look at Saturn, I mean, the rings are quite enigmatic. There was this theory put together by Dr. Norman Berggren that maintains that the shots by the Cassini mission indicate tube-like instruments which may be creating Saturn's rings. Are you familiar with that, Jay?
Oh, I am. I don't think he was. I think he was talking about the Voyager photos from the 70s. But yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff in the rings. And also, don't forget that J.R.R. Tolkien, who was led into the library at Oxford, reading the books that only he could read the languages. And when he started writing Lord of the Rings, which is, told people that he was not writing an allegory or a metaphor. He was writing the true history of Europe 6,500 years ago. And I can't believe it's just a coincidence that he named his villain Sauron, which is very close to Sargon, who is also a Saturnian ruler of Mesopotamia and really the first slaveholder, builder of cities, Freemason, all of these things. And so I think that the name Lord of the Rings that Tolkien attributed to, titled his book, is really about Saturn, who is the Lord of the Rings.
That's absolutely right. And that's where and why people wear wedding rings. We're going to get onto this, as I said, a bit later on. It's just that setting up this idea of this massive influence this huge planet has in people's minds, because the influence of it in the symbolism that we're going to be talking about is quite immense. It goes through absolutely every part of our lives. And the idea is that it may have been a lot nearer, a lot closer to the Earth thousands of years ago. Are you familiar with that theory?
Oh yeah, I've read all. If there's a book about Saturn, I've read it, so I know everything that there is about it. And yeah, it could be. I don't know. Like I say, something happened, and a lot of Troy's allegories are compelling, to say the least. But it can't be proven. That's the only problem with that. But the history of like I say, Tolkien and going back in time, it's quite clear and obvious that Saturn has this huge influence. What's interesting is that the south pole of Saturn is this big eye. It's a hurricane, but it looks like an eye. And of course, in the movie Lord of the Rings, Sauron was, depicted as a giant eye. So it's very interesting. Of course, we know that the North Pole of Saturn has a hexagonal structure, which is inexplicable in many ways too. NASA at first denied that there was a hexagon at the North Pole. When the Voyager took a picture of it, they said, "Oh, it's just a lens and lens flare or something. We don't know what it is." But then Cassini took a picture of it, and it was still there 30 years later. So then NASA had to cop to the fact that it really was there, but they still can't explain why the clouds are going in a hexagonal pattern at the North Pole.
It's a total enigma, really, isn't it? I mean, Velikovsky maintained that Venus and Mars could have been at times in conjunction with Saturn, and this is where a lot of the symbolism comes from, of the eye. And you've got the morning star Venus with the rays coming out of it, 8 rays, and this is an ancient symbol that goes back to at least Akkadian or Sumerian, doesn't it?
Yes, it does, and it begs the question, what did our ancestors know? And and once we ask that and we start looking, of course, the problem is that all of our history has been subjugated by popes and kings and rewritten. So we're having a lot of trouble finding a lot of the history as being accurate. And I think that we don't really know. That's the problem with this whole thing. We're literally blind men walking around in the dark.
Yes, and they're still using these symbols today. Every single religion on this planet seems to use Saturnian symbols when you start looking into this. So it's right out in the open, but not talked about. And as this show goes on, we're going to talk about how this influences the banking system, the police, all the systems of law and order, education. Everything we're being told is basically being filtered through the Saturnian cult, if you look into it.
Yeah, and it's the secret cult behind the Jovian cult. So the exoteric religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism appear to be Jovian cults. So they worship Jehovah, which is Jupiter, but actually they don't. They worship Saturn. The deep inside the religions, you find out that actually they're Saturnian. And I think this is endlessly fascinating because they've set up kind of a bogeyman of Jehovah, while at the same time the real guy is Saturn or Set or Satan, or any of those words are all allusions to Saturn, which is, again, extremely fascinating. As is Saturday, by the way. Saturday is Saturn's day.
That's right.
And you can kind of, I mean, is it a coincidence, that the Rothschilds use a six-pointed hexagonal star as their logo, and they go to the synagogue on Saturday, and Saturn has a hexagon at the North Pole? It's all these weird coincidences that generally start piling up on each other.
It's also known as the Black Sun, and in many ways, the ruling sun in previous civilizations. And this does indicate that it must have been much more prominent in the sky at some point.
Yeah, it does appear to be that way. I've actually heard a scholar telling me that the Antichrist is Saturn, and not anti like anti, but anti like before. So the God before Christ was Saturn, and Saturn is the Antichrist, or the previous God. And it's almost like the Jehovah is the Wizard of Oz. He's the man behind the curtain. He's the Oz, but the man behind the curtain is Saturn.
That's great. I mean, it just goes on and on, this Saturn cult. The Romans named their capital Saturnia, and of course their winter solstice, which became the Christian Christmas, was the Saturnalia. Right. And this is also tied in with Dionysus, who's also a kind of representative of the Saturn cult. I mean, it's a very broad sphere of influence, actually, isn't it? It goes from kind of procreation to death, but its concentration of the energies seems to be on control.
It's actually time. What Saturn is the furthest out planet that we can see, and so it becomes like a giant clock, at least to the ancients. And what it does is it sets time. So Saturn is the God that creates consecutive sequential time, and traps us in time. Because once we believe that time is sequential, which it isn't, time is ever flowing. As Einstein said, you sit on a hot stove for 1 minute, it'll seem like an hour. You spend 1 minute 1 hour talking to a beautiful woman, it only seems like a minute. So time isn't really sequential, and it's not really what we think it is. We've created a contrivance. The rulers of this world have created time as a contrivance so that we can catch the airplanes and all meet at dinner at the same time and all go to work at the same time and be good slaves. But really, Saturn, its time is not sequential. Time is relative, and so Saturn is a false god entrapping us in time.
That's right. Time is indeed created in our own consciousness, the idea of this ticking timeline is something that has a huge impact on us, because we're almost born into this cult of birth and death. And Saturn is also the Grim Reaper. He's always there measuring our time, saying we haven't got enough of it. And
that's right.
This goes into law, and the banking system and the police.
We're always racing ahead, thinking that we're going to get somewhere, and then everything is going to be fine. As soon as I get enough money, then I'll be fine. As soon as I, get rid of my sickness, I'll be fine. As soon as I find the right woman, I'll be fine. But you're fine right now. And so this is the influence of the Saturnian cults, is to always make us anxious and frightful that we're going to run out of time. And
yes, indeed. And that whole idea of time being created in our own consciousness gives us, in a way, this kind of insight and way out of this cult of Saturn, because I think the cult of Saturn controls us unconsciously with a lot of this imagery and the way society's been created. The way out of that is to realize that we are timeless.
Yeah, if you have ever examined the work of Jordan Maxwell, he shows you all the Saturnian logos and that corporations have, and flags of nations and countries are all using the Saturnian symbolism, and it's amazing actually. Nissan and Chrysler and all these companies are using all this Saturnian symbology, and none of us know it.
Yeah, we're acting out something that we don't understand, and the key to enlightenment is to understand how we're being controlled. And this planet exerts an enormous influence in every area, as we've just been saying. I hope people are sort of interested in waking up to that, because, for instance, when you graduate from university, you wear the black mortarboard, the black square, which is the same as the Kaaba stone. It's Saturn. The Saturn goes through all religions, including Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And the symbols of that are also in the Hindu tradition, and even way before that. This goes back, as we're talking about, thousands and thousands of years, and the origins of it are quite lost in a way, aren't they?
Well, they are, and probably there was some kind of catastrophe or something which hid this knowledge from us. Maybe the catastrophe was Saturn itself, something that happened with it. As Troy says, Saturn was our sun, and it was moved away from us by the entrance of our other sun, the sun we have now coming in, and that could be there was something happened, something immense happened, which changed the earth and wiped our memories. And the New World Order, whoever you want to call them, the Illuminati, they're using that to their advantage. Our amnesia is being used to their advantage.
That's a very good way of putting it. We're being controlled unconsciously, and with a lot of this symbolism and the way our society is structured. We'll be continuing the discussion with Jay and Troy after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Windows on the World. We're talking about the cult of Saturn, a huge planet with a huge influence which may have been a lot nearer to the Earth in ancient times. We're still talking to Jay Weidner, and now I'd like to go into the symbolism of Saturn and how it affects us in our daily lives. Are you still there, Jay?
I am.
Great. For instance, one of the lesser known cults is the cult of Octagon, which is the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar used octagonal towers in all their churches. They believed in the number 8. The number 8 is relative to Saturn. It's about law and order, control. And the number 8 is always coming down from the heavens into the ground and always causes friction. It's a type of spirituality which meets materialism. And this is where Saturn's very important in my view, because the Templars were very obsessed with this. And if you go into the City of London and look on the door handles of banks, they're octagonal. They have octagonal door handles. The base of pillars is octagonal. So this is another thing, that Saturn rules number 8. It is numerologically number 8 and also astrologically Capricorn. Can you expand on that a bit, Jay?
On Capricorn?
Yeah, well, on the whole thing of the numerological aspect as well.
Well, again, Saturn is the planet that fixes us. That's what you're really kind of referring to. It fixes us and it entraps us. That's what it is, and it circles. In the ancients, it circles us. The only planet that can be seen is far out there, and it's like a corral, and it's circling us and corralling us. And that's what most of the symbolism is pertaining to, is the fact it's a corral, where it's a wedding ring, which means you're now, pretty much committed to one person, or maybe even the slave to that person. Or in the ancient traditions from Mesopotamia, they literally built Saturn effigies and things to their great god. And another thing that needs to be said here is that in the Nag Hammadi, we were talking about the archons last week, in the Nag Hammadi, they seem to intimate that the archons came from Saturn. So we might be dealing with extraterrestrials even from a moon of Saturn, and that are actually controlling us, and that may be the absolute origins of the Saturn cult. Is that a group of people from the planetary system, or if it was here before, here are ruling us, and they are clearly Saturnian followers. There's just no doubt about it, and everything that we do is from their cult.
Yes, and of course the moon does have quite an influence. We see the moon, and of course the moon deals with lunacy and undercurrents, and it's meant to be a very female but negative influence. But it seems like the influence of Saturn goes way back, and that's what I find really interesting, because there seems to be a lot more symbolism relating to Saturn than the moon, which does indicate that it could have been closer at some time. I find that extremely fascinating. But once you start looking at Saturn, it's a massive, massive planet, and the rings are quite enigmatic. It's got this, as I've said, it's got this hexagon at the North Pole and what looks like an eye at the South Pole.
Yep.
And if you look at these ancient symbolisms, like, the pre-Sumerian stuff, it's got what looks like an eye, but you've got Venus, which is the morning star, with rays coming out of it. Then you have another planet behind that, then another planet, which is Saturn. So you've got, allegedly, Venus, Mars, and Saturn could have been in some kind of conjunction or rotational alignment. Could you expand on that? Have you heard about that?
Oh yeah, that's Troy's work, and it's great work. And there's a lot in the past that would seem to indicate that he might be right. The I mean, I can't even. It's so amazing, because Saturn it gives off more energy than it receives, so it's almost like a mini sun. So you could theoretically receive warmth from Saturn. It could act like a sun and actually warm up the planets around it. And what I'm really interested, though, in knowing from Troy is, how did Saturn acquire its current satellites? That would be an interesting question.
Well, that's a great time, Jay, to bring Troy into the conversation now. Troy, are you there?
I am indeed, yes.
Great. Troy McLaughlin, welcome to Windows on the World. It was your interest in the electric universe theory that got you looking into Saturn. Can you just give us a bit of your background?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks very much for having me on. And absolute pleasure to be on with you, Jay. Your work's been quite influential in a lot of my own researches, so that's a real pleasure.
Same here.
Yeah, well, it's the stuff that you did with Kubrick, with the that you mentioned before with Saturn and so on. These were all triggers when I was doing my own research that pulled things together. So thanks very much for that. Been great work. Yes, I got involved in the study into Saturn because I originally studied ancient history, Egyptology, when I was at university, and I ran into the extreme reactions that the mainstream academia has for the likes of Immanuel Velikovsky. And so I dropped out of those studies into other studies, completed my degree, and since that time I've been keeping tabs on things to do with the progression of the studies to do with Saturn. And as things have gone along, there have been other people, Dave Talbot, Eduardo Cardona, Ev Cochran, people of that caliber who've expanded on Velikovsky and produced a very plausible form of cosmology to explain what ancient mythology tells us was happening in the skies. And of course, the battle there is that mainstream science is very much geared by the uniformitarian ethos, and they cannot conceive that the skies would be any different than they are today within the last 200,000 years. And so when reading mythology, we've had the waters muddied terribly by symbols being attributed to our current sun when it should have been attributed to Saturn. To give you an example, Mark, you mentioned the black sun. The reason that Saturn is always associated with the black sun was because it shone at night, at a time when you also had the other sun had dipped in behind in the west. Saturn continued to shine at night and was placed in the northern areas. All the religions, all the monuments point to the north as its original resting place. And that has always fascinated me. But, to just enlarge on the question you ask, why Saturn for these cults today? When we talk about the symbols and so on that come down from Saturn, what we find is that symbols are actually a manifestation, a graphical manifestation usually of deep-seated archetypes that sit in our subconscious. And Saturn is inextricably, the god Saturn is inextricably linked with the concept of doomsday. And that doomsday anxiety that humanity has, if it can be manipulated, it makes for a fantastic control mechanism. And this is why, as Jay quite correctly points out, when you look deep behind the Jovian religions, you find this Saturnian influence there. It is quite simply the creator god who also turned the destructive god, and that doomsday anxiety gives them, the chance to basically justify their claim for authority over us in the name of Saturn.
Yeah, perpetual fear and control, really.
Yeah, doomsday is the big one that keeps us all fearful. A return to doomsday, I should say.
So the fact that Saturn seems to have symbolism in all the major religions is really no coincidence.
Yes, it is the original, God planet. It's just that our cosmology in the electric universe, the subset known as Saturn theory, identifies the planet Saturn with that god, something that the ancients definitely did. Modern scholars have thoroughly muddied the waters because they just could not equate what they were reading in the mythology, in the various mythologies. And I'm talking about world mythologies all around the world. There's a comparative basis for all cultures having identified the northern seat of where Saturn existed, or the version of Saturn in whatever culture you're looking at, and that it was always identified with the planets. But scholars in the 1800s, they basically couldn't reconcile with the sky we see today. And so therefore they attributed this immobile, static sun that shone at night to, a blanket attributing to the current sun that we have today.
Yeah, this is really fascinating stuff because it goes into so many areas. I mean, when we walk into a court, the judge is wearing the black robes, the police wear black. These are all colours associated with Saturn, with control. As we've said, you get into a contract, you have a wedding ring. That's a form of control. These are all things that are exerted on our daily lives. Most of us are totally unaware of it. The whole idea of law and order and the iron fist really is Saturn, because it's there controlling in the background all the time. And if we can release ourselves from this control, from this assumption, then we can see things as they really are. It's very difficult to do that when we are constantly fed this stuff, which is it's conscious and subconscious. So the influence that this planet has is really through the people who are perpetuating that influence. Would you like to just come in on that, Jay?
Yeah, it's interesting because the German, the Skull and Bones, whose number is 322, was actually a German Saturnian society that came to Yale in the 1800s, according to Anthony Sutton. And and the Nazis called themselves the New Templars. And of course, the Nazis worshiped the Black Sun. And so it's very interesting. They also, and so all these influences coming from the Germany are incredibly fascinating. And then you begin looking back into the Thule Society and the origins of Nazism, and you find out that, again, we're talking about a completely Saturnian cult. And it transferred itself over into the United States and became NASA. And then of course, what is the first, what is the planet that NASA wants to explore more than any other? Well, it happens to be Saturn. And what have they discovered out there on Saturn? Well, we don't know. We only know what they tell us. But this goes back to my belief that there's a secret space program, and that they went out there to Saturn a lot further back than we think. And that Arthur C. Clarke knew a lot more about Saturn and its moons back in the 60s than he should have. And so it begs the question, how did Arthur C. Clarke know that Iapetus was this strange-looking moon and place it as the place where the monolith would be at the end of 2001: A Space Odyssey? And I don't know what to say, except that there's just too many lines pointing towards a group of Saturnian worshipers controlling this world that I don't think it can be denied anymore.
Well, if we look at the analogy of Saturn, that fits exactly with it. You've got people who are in the know and people who aren't. And the people who know are the ones who are perpetuating this cult. So it's very, very interesting. So there is, in other words, still a priest class on this planet who know what's going on, and they're keeping it from the majority of the population. Well, there's no change there then, is there?
No, and I would say the Catholic Church is Saturnian, even though they would deny it. There's Saturnian symbols all over the Vatican. Priests wear black. The whole thing, it's just kind of creepy. I mean,
well, also, of course, it came from the Roman Pauline Church, which right. was, if you look back at as we've said earlier, the Romans' name for Rome basically was Saturnia then, and of course they celebrate the Saturnalia. So they were getting it from somewhere. That was, we're going back a few thousand years here, but it's not that long when you consider yes. the amount of time that we've been told there was nothing happening on this planet. They go about civilization go about 6,000 or 7,000 years. Well, we know for a fact that that's just completely untrue because of what's been found in the fossil record, and of course, reading books like Forbidden History and Forbidden Archaeology, people who speak out about these things are pretty much shut down, and that's again, that's the cult of Saturn shutting them down. So it kind of goes full circle, doesn't it?
Yeah, they discovered the city in Turkey, Göbekli, and it's been carbon dated at 12,000 years old, and it hasn't changed the history books or anything. They absolutely know that this city is at least 12,000 years old, yet they continue to tell us that civilization didn't start until about 6,000 years ago. It's unbelievable, actually, what they get away with. It's just, I can't even believe it.
Well, I think
so.
Once we look into it, Jay, it does become very apparent, but it does take an awful lot of study. So, Troy, just give us a bit of your opinion there of how Saturn is controlling us and how it's got behind these major religions.
Well, okay, in Saturn Death Cult, the book that I put out, I argue for the idea that the modern manifestations of this cult centered around the mythical god Saturn must be viewed as essentially a cultural phenomenon, basically a culture that is born from an accumulated set of ideas, beliefs that are based on a highly distorted understanding the original Saturn mythology and religion that collapsed at the end of what we call the Golden Age. It's basically this understanding, this distorted understanding that we have amongst various organizations. And I have to emphasize it's various organizations. I lump the royals and of many cultures in with Catholic churches. The whole lot of them all use these archetypes from that time as their control mechanisms to assert power. But basically, the understanding that they have of Saturnian archetypes, religion, if you want to put it that way, it facilitates the desire by these various elite agendas to ensure their continued control over the productive capacity and the resources of the world's population. And so what I'm attempting to say in Saturn Death Cult is that this Saturnian-based culture has culminated most visibly and most dangerously as today's central banking model of debt-based finance. It's a system that has perpetuated war and suffering for centuries amongst the greater majority of people on this planet, and it utilizes the symbols that we've been talking about to trigger those doomsday anxieties to keep people in line.
Yeah, well, it's very useful for the cult of Saturn to be used by those who want to control us, because it is a controlling influence. So these people are merely kind of vessels for the influence of Saturn. Would you like to just comment on that, Jay?
Oh, they are. You know, let's not forget that in the Saturnian myth, Saturn finds out that he's going to be overthrown by one of his children, so he begins killing all of his children and eating them. And it's only when one of his wives takes pity on her baby Jove or Zeus and keeps him hidden from Saturn, that Saturn is overthrown. But Saturn is a child eater. He's into eating children, killing children. He's the Grim Reaper. He's, it's pretty hairy when you start looking into the myths of Saturn, what's really being said here. And, I can't believe, I believe that whoever it is that rules this world, that the single man who's at the very top, he probably is the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. But this top-down control system does seem to fit in with this belief in the Saturn cult. So you can't really have one without the other. You can't say, oh, it's just a control system without bringing Saturn in, because if we look at how Saturn's been set up as the controller through thousands of years, then you have to come to the conclusion that it has some influence, and that brings us on to the rings of Saturn and the eerie sounds that come out of Saturn that have been recorded. They're slightly out of our audible range, but they have been decoded by NASA. And this like roaring and screaming sounds coming out of there all the time. So like you were saying earlier, Jay, it does seem to generate its own energy, doesn't it?
Well, it does. And, the work that's been done on the rings, I forget his name. What's that scientist's name that did the work on the rings of Saturn? He wrote the book. I can't remember his name now. Anyway, he wrote an incredible book and showed you pictures of all sorts of objects in the rings, inexplicable objects in the rings, and even to this day, we really don't have a very satisfactory explanation as to how the rings were formed. If the rings were formed the way that science tells us that they were formed, then there shouldn't be the kind of record player grooves that are in the rings. They should have started smoothing out by now, but that's not what happened. They're still kind of, you can see that each ring around Saturn is its own ring, and it's not like slowly falling apart and mixing in with the other rings. They're still rigid rings, like an LP, like the ring, the rings around a record, the old record player. And so, I think that my personal opinion is that the Germans or the Nazis or somebody got the truth about Saturn in the past and became obsessed with it, and the whole entire reason for NASA, in my belief, was to go to Saturn and check it out.
That's absolutely fascinating, Jay. I know you've got to leave us. We're going for a break. We're going to continue the discussion with Troy, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Thanks very much, Jay Weidner. Fascinating as usual. Welcome back to Windows on the World. We're discussing the Cult of Saturn. We've had a great conversation with Jay Weidner, and we're going to continue with Troy McLaughlin. Are you there, Troy?
I am indeed.
Great. So yeah, this worldwide control system backed by this Cult of Saturn is everywhere, isn't it? I'd like to just talk in the last part of the show about how we can free ourselves from the shackles of this planet that seems to be influencing us on pretty much every second of the day through the people who are controlling the planet. We've also got some symbols which you won't be able to see. We're going to put up on the screen. I'm just going to mention them because this shows you how far back this Cult of Saturn actually goes. But before we do, yeah, here we go. We've got Roman coins, I think. We've got also other images from ancient Egypt, which we'll be showing. But as these are coming up on the screen, Troy, can you give us some more insight into how you think the Cult of Saturn is still controlling us?
Well, it comes really down to what Jay talks about, Saturn being the god of time. He has many manifestations, the Grim Reaper and so on, but Father Time, in the Greek pantheon, he is known as Chronos, and this is, of course, where we get chronology and, the chronometer.
That's right, just on the screen now, Troy, you can't see this, but it's a Sumerian symbol, right. And it shows the Saturn, basically the image of Saturn on the front of this costume, with these three planets, which show again that Venus, Mars, Saturn conjunction.
Is that the one with the 8-pointed light rays star?
Yes, that's what it does from the front, but this is a side view of something that looks Akkadian or Sumerian. But this does go back a long time, doesn't it? I mean, yes. If we're going back many thousands of years before Christianity, so this cult has been going on really since, it could be hundreds of thousands of years. We just don't know. This is a Sumerian image again with what you're talking about, the 8-pointed star with Saturn in the background. Again, Venus, the morning star with Saturn in the background. Can you just expand on this for us a little bit about this conjunction that may have happened in the sky, which Velikovsky talks about?
Right. Well, this is the cosmology that seeks to unravel the mystery behind a lot of what the Saturn cult ideas tend to use, as their symbols and as their control mechanisms to affect these archetypes that we have deep in our subconscious. And it's really to understand that, unlike modern scholarship that basically has equated mythology with a form of fiction, psychodramas played out by ancients as a way of defining their existence and so on, that in fact mythology is telling us about real celestial events, natural events, not magical, not any kind of hocus pocus or anything along those lines, but basically the original understanding of the Saturnian cult was to understand the role that the planets that currently make up our solar system once played when they were in vastly different conjunctions. Now, the conjunction that you're looking at within the Saturn theory subset of the electric universe, I favor what Eduardo Cardona, one of the researchers, talks about as what's called a polar configuration. Now, as I mentioned before, the black sun is related to Saturn because it's shone at night. And when you're in a situation where you've got Saturn, the planet, acting as originally as a brown dwarf star, a lot more glow coming out of it than we see today, and you also have the sun, the only way that the ancients could really conceive of seeing the Saturnian glow at night was if the Saturn resided at the celestial North Pole of the Earth. And this actually is exactly what mythology bangs on about, that Saturn was always seated in the celestial North. The Chinese point to that, various cultures, the Egyptians, the Great Pyramid is the most celestially north, perfectly oriented building on the planet, even to this day, even more so than the Greenwich Observatory here in the UK. And that connection of Saturn in the north is basically creates what's called a polar configuration. Now, for people with a celestial mechanics background, Newtonian mechanics, this seems almost preposterous, the idea that you could have planets literally stacked up on each other, rotating on their axles under each other. But this is effectively what mythology is describing. And I have to say that as far as the physics go, we've made certain inroads in this. I've had people say this is completely ridiculous, nothing can be seen, observed in the universe like this. Well, that's no longer true. Herbig-Haro objects that astronomers have named are actually polar aligned, axially rotating objects out in deep space, and there's well over 300 of them now being catalogued. And so the idea that objects can actually travel in a axial alignment on their polar orientations is not out of the question. I mean, the comet Levy-Shoemaker that slammed into Jupiter did exactly that with its 22 pieces. When it broke up, it formed a polar aligned configuration before slamming into Jupiter. So this configuration, mythology tells us, existed at a time they dubbed the Golden Age, and then it broke up, and that's what created the doomsday anxiety within the human race, the indelible mark that these catastrophes, these planetary catastrophes, left on us due to these celestial events, which has basically, as the solar system settled down, these archetypes, these marks in our psyche, our corporate psyche, have been exploited to take the cult of Saturn in the malicious direction that it is now. And that simply, in my opinion, equates to this desire by certain elites to have for themselves a golden age lifestyle at the expense of the rest of us, now that the golden age has finished and we're in a season, four-season type environment where food shortages and resources are at a premium.
That's right, and this control system and the way that we've been managed through time, and this collective amnesia that the human race seem to have of who they are and where they came from, all ties into that, because we are ripe to be controlled if we don't know who we are or where we came from. And a lot of people on this planet don't really even think about things like that. The control system really does work because we accept this slavery and this system that's imposed on us, and it's imposed through law, banking, and all sorts of daily control. Education system is basically a system of control and brainwashing, especially now. And the education system now just seems to be a propaganda exercise. And when people come out with their university degrees, which they have to get, they're only allowed degrees of information. They're never given the full information. And this is all part of the Saturn cult, because as we said earlier on, they wear the black mortarboard hat, which is also the black Kaaba stone of Islam. When people are walking around that black Kaaba stone at the Hajj, they are unconsciously worshipping Saturn, and that brings them into a lower vibrational frequency. That's my opinion. A lot of people who go to the Hajj have a wonderful time, but it really, at the back of all this, is a control system that we just don't understand.
Well, the understanding, in my opinion, Mark, is that you have to go back to what Saturn is identified first primarily with, and that is being the father of time. Time is a measure, all right? And the ability to calculate time was something that mythology tells us that humans did not have for an indeterminate time into the past. There was what they would call a twilight primordial era of a purple dawn, where light was very dark, very gloomy. Then this dull orb that existed in the north suddenly flared up into light. It's what the biblical account refers to as the let there be light moment in terms of the creative effort. And as a result of that flaring up of Saturn, human beings were given the capacity to be able to calculate time. And from time comes all manner of measures. And really, any form of legal structure, any form of financial system, they're all based on measures. And that stems from that initial ability to calculate time. And of course, when Saturn's influence was finally derailed by the influence of the sun, and Saturn was banned out to the orbit that we have today, the legacy left by Saturn was this concept of measures and basically measures and weights, and the control over what defines the measure and weight by which we govern our lives and so on is essentially what's behind a lot of the Saturnian religions, desire for control the system, and you control the people. It's a far more effective way than just having a bunch of tough guys telling you what to do.
That's absolutely correct, because then the people keep themselves in line, and that's really what all this is about.
Yeah, if you trigger those archetypes in doing so, if you say this is the system, and hey, guess what? We're going to cloak it in all these symbols that go back to Saturnian symbols. There is a deep subconscious reaction on the part of most people to that, which basically says, yep, you guys must be the guys in control. You guys must be in charge. And, this is the reason they stamp this stuff over the US dollar, over our currency systems, and so on. And it's really all just to effectively corral us all in to a system that provides the resources for an elite few to live a lifestyle that had apparently existed under the Golden Age before Saturn's fall.
That's right. It keeps us in fear of the gods and keeps us in our place through this constant reminding through the law system, the banking system, the education system, that we are being monitored, we are being controlled. The way out of that, in my opinion, is to free ourselves mentally, and then none of this stuff can really impact on you. The problem is, on a day-to-day level, that's quite difficult the way things are, especially with the financial implosion that's going on worldwide. I'd just like to thank you for being on the show, Troy. Would you like to come on again?
Oh, I'd be delighted, Mark.
It's been absolutely fantastic, and it always goes too fast. So I'd just like to say that's great. Thanks to Jay Weidner, Troy McLaughlin, and it's good night from me, Mark Windows. Keep watching those, watching us, watching the people's voice. We'll see you soon.
We just wanted to get to Saturn, and they've been out at Saturn, and they've been photographing it, and the moons around Saturn, and they found some incredibly interesting things. The most incredibly interesting thing that they found is, of course, Iapetus, the moon, which appears to be either artificial or has been manipulated in the past, and which is ironic because this goes all the way back to Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick in 2001, because the original planet that the astronaut Bowman was going to in the book 2001: A Space Odyssey was Iapetus, the moon of Saturn. Supposedly Kubrick couldn't redo Saturn. The rings were too difficult for his special effects department, so they switched the planet in the movie to Jupiter. But of course, I don't buy that. I believe that he was told, no, you can't do that. And so he switched it, and not for a second do I believe that Douglas Trumbull in the special effects department working for Stanley could not have made the rings of Saturn believable. So it all goes back to this secret society and how they run things. and they are Saturnian. They worship Saturn. They worship time. They have enslaved us with time because Saturn is the ruler of time. And I'm sure Troy can go on with much more about this, but basically we have to come to grips with this fact that we're being ruled by this planet for reasons that we don't understand.
That's exactly right, and we're going to get to this enormous influence that it exerts a bit later in the show. But first of all, just to look at Saturn, I mean, the rings are quite enigmatic. There was this theory put together by Dr. Norman Berggren that maintains that the shots by the Cassini mission indicate tube-like instruments which may be creating Saturn's rings. Are you familiar with that, Jay?
Oh, I am. I don't think he was. I think he was talking about the Voyager photos from the 70s. But yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff in the rings. And also, don't forget that J.R.R. Tolkien, who was led into the library at Oxford, reading the books that only he could read the languages. And when he started writing, is the fact that it is the farthest planet away that we can actually see with our naked eye. And it has all of these historical people in history who have been our rulers have been principally Saturnian worshipers. And everything from Set in Egypt, who was the evil god, I guess you could call him, all the way to today with the New World Order is apparently Saturnian. The Germans that worked on Operation Paperclip were part of Saturnian society, which is why they named the Saturn V rocket that went to the moon, supposedly, that's why they named it that. And also I think it's also why NASA is more or less obsessed with Saturn, which is why the Cassini craft is out there right now. They were willing to risk 72 pounds of plutonium on the space shuttle when they launched it to get to Saturn. You can imagine what would have happened if that space shuttle had exploded on its launch. It would have killed everybody in the world. But they didn't seem to care.
Welcome to Windows on the World with me, Mark Windows, 3 times a week at 10 p.m. GMT, Monday, Tuesday and Thursday, bringing you cutting-edge news, empowering information and no conspiracy theories. On tonight's show, how does a planet as far away as Saturn have such an influence on symbols, religion and our system of law and order? If you don't think it does, we are going to give you some insight into symbols and conventions associated with this age-old primeval sun, whose position in the sky could have changed. There was a time when it could have been much nearer and exerted much more influence. To discuss this, we have Troy McLaughlin, whose interest in the electric universe theory led him into the study of this huge presence and its enigmatic rings. And also we have Jay Weidner, author, filmmaker and Hermetic scholar, who has been described by Wired magazine as an authority on the Hermetic and alchemical traditions and an erudite conspiracy hunter, a modern-day Indiana Jones. His ongoing quest is to find mankind's spiritual destiny. Jay Weidner, hi, are you there?
I am. How are you?
Great to have you on again, Jay.
Yeah.
We had a really brilliant show last time talking about Kubrick's films.
Yep.
And today we're going to talk about the Cult of Saturn. Now, this is something that you've studied quite extensively, isn't it?
Yeah, I have. It's a fascinating subject, actually.
Yeah, so the age of Saturn, the official age, is around 4.5 billion years, which is also the assumed age of the universe. Now, we know nothing about really when Saturn was formed, but it does seem to have a huge influence. Now, Saturn worship and influence goes back much further than the current religions. So why do these religions incorporate Saturnian symbols from ancient times?
Well, I think that actually the worship of Saturn preceded the worship of Jove or Jovian or Zeus or Yahweh or Jehovah, whatever you call him, who's really represented by the planet Jupiter. And before that, as Troy knows, Saturn was the main worship planet. Why? I don't know. Troy's opinion on the electric universe is extremely interesting. It can't be proven, but it's extremely interesting. What I find interesting about Saturn